Hi, everyone. Welcome in. Welcome to our very special virtual author visit with Samantha Cohoe that's tied to our Battle of the Books. We're going to give everybody a couple minutes to come in on Zoom. Sometimes it takes Zoom a minute to let everybody in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. Just to start off, for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Kathryn Hunt. I am the director of the Lincoln Public Library, and I am so excited that you are all joining us virtually this evening. And for anyone who's watching this on recording later, I'm so excited you've decided to watch through this author visit. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping in case you have not been to one of our virtual author visits before, so you know what our evening's going to look like. This program will last for just about an hour. During it, for most of it to begin with, Samantha Cohoe, our author, and I are going to be in a conversation about her work, particularly her book, Bright Ruined Things, which is one of our Battle of the Book selections. Beautiful cover right there with Samantha. And then we will have time at the end for question and answer. I highly encourage you, if you have any questions while we're having our conversation, to please drop them into the Q&A option in your Zoom window. That should be down at the bottom of your Zoom, says Q&A. That's just an easy place for us to keep track of your questions, which will help me keep track of our time, make sure we can get to, if at all possible, all of those questions. If you're not able to put your questions in through the Q&A, say you're joining us on phone, you can go ahead and hit *9 right at the very end. I'll let you know when. That will let you raise your hand so we know to let you speak. But we do try and get through the text ones first because it's a little bit easier to join similar questions together. I've mentioned a couple times now, Battle of the Books. For any of you who aren't aware, this particular author visit is tied with a fantastic teen program that we're doing called Battle of the Books, which is a book trivia challenge for teens. So if you know a young person or are a young person in the grades 9 through 12, and you want to challenge your friends for who knows the most about our series of books, I encourage you to join our Battle of the Books program. We are taking team signups through January 7th, and you can find more on our website. But one of those titles is Bright Ruined Things, which is written by our fantastic author, Samantha Cohoe, who's joined us.
Hello.
Hey, Samantha. So Samantha writes historically inspired young adult fantasy. She is a California native from San Luis Obispo, and grew up with beach trips, omnivorous reading, and I love this, writing stories brimming with adverbs. Adverbs are also my favorite grammatical feature and flaw, depending on who you're talking to about writing. And is currently in Denver with her family and is a writer, a Latin teacher, a mom, and of course, a voracious reader. And thank you for joining us, Samantha. This is so exciting.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
How is everything in Denver?
It's cold. Yeah, it's cold and full of exiles from California like myself. So, yeah, it's a good place to live if you like skiing, which I don't, but I still like it here. It's good.
There's some other things too.
Yeah.
So I was hoping we'd talk a little bit, maybe first about your book, Bright Ruined Things, which is your second book that you've published.
Yep.
And then after that, maybe talk a little bit about your practice and your background as a writer, if that sounds good to you.
Sounds great.
Perfect. So in case we have some people here who haven't had a chance to read your book, could you tell us a little bit about a little bit of what Bright Ruined Things is about?
Yeah. So Bright Ruined Things, it's a young adult historical fantasy. I think of it as The Tempest meets The Great Gatsby. So it's set in a magical 1920s on an island where a rich and powerful family controls the magical resources of this island, which is enables them to become even more rich and powerful. And this family has a great big decadent Gatsby style party once a year when they let outsiders to come to the island. And this year, the family's all gathering. They all have secrets. There's a particularly terrible secret sort of at the heart of the island. And over the course of one very eventful night, all the secrets come out.
Ooh,
Yeah.
very nice. So Tempest and Gatsby are two pretty big influences. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with those texts, with those authors, what kind of brought you into wanting to do this kind of inspired piece pulling on those two sources?
Yeah. So for me, I'll start with Gatsby. I love writing about magic, but in my books, magic tends to be it tends to just represent power and often money as well. So The Great Gatsby is really a book about money and class and status. And in my books, magic just sort of goes with all of those things: money, status, class, power, the things that people hoard, that they keep from others, and that they use over others. So that well, plus who doesn't like a glamorous 1920s style party, right? Like that's always going to be fun. And flapper dresses. And that related for me to The Tempest, because The Tempest is a play about, well, depends on who you ask what it's actually about, but one of the obvious themes throughout is colonialism. And The Tempest is set on this beautiful natural island that has these inhabitants who've been there, who have been, Shakespeare would sort of indicate tamed, but in reality, they've been enslaved by the wizard Prospero. And I think when we read The Tempest these days with sort of modern eyes, there are things about the way The Tempest, the way the story goes, that jump out to us as just like, huh, that's interesting. Like at the end of The Tempest, Prospero frees one of his magical slaves, Ariel, the spirit, but he doesn't free Caliban, who is also was on this island before he was, and is his mother was the witch who Prospero conquered, and so you tend to think maybe you want to draw a different conclusion from the end of the story than Shakespeare drew. And for me, my interest in The Tempest, first of all, I mean, a magical island is always going to be a really fun place to set a story. But I was also interested in exploring some of the themes of The Tempest in terms of, from a different perspective. So I think that's what I did.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I loved what you were saying there in how you use magic in literature as being tied to, you said, money and power. And I think these things that we can often see magic in literature as being another tool by which people can enact their will on the world. And sometimes the people around them are okay with that. And sometimes, and as you're saying with The Tempest, the people around them are not.
Right.
Which does have a lot of parallels to how money can be used in the world.
Yeah.
A lot of things happen if you have enough money, even if the people taking it aren't pleased outside of that transaction with what that's looking like.
Right. And then, of course, another theme of The Great Gatsby to me, or something that I took away from it when I read it, was this outsider. I love stories about outsiders. They're always the most fun to me. And how he's doing his best to make himself somebody who can be accepted in this society, so that he can get the love of the woman that he's always loved, and sort of the futility of that. And it's not just the futility of it. It's not just that he can never quite do it, but you also see throughout the course of The Great Gatsby, I think, that like, is it really worth it? Is the thing that you're after here something that's valuable? Because you see the people who have what Gatsby wants are kind of horrible. And my protagonist in Bright Ruined Things, her name is May. This is her. She is not one of the Prospers, not one of the rich, powerful people, but she was raised on this island as sort of a forgotten ward. Basically, she was the daughter of a servant who died. And she just lived there, and she's never left. So it's her home, but she also doesn't really belong there, and she wants to. And so she's pursuing all the things that she pursues are because she really wants to belong and she wants to be accepted. So for me, that was another very Gatsby-esque element.
Absolutely. And in this, she is pursuing kind of magic, correct?
Yes.
One of the things that she's looking for on her own.
Yeah, this is the thing that she thinks is going to be her path to really belonging, is if she can be, because there aren't very many magicians in this world. There are basically 3. And it's hoarded even by this family. Even among the family members, only a few of them actually get to have magic. So to her, it's the ultimate status symbol. Plus power. She actually wants to be able to do magic because it's very cool. Yeah.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So now, what kind of goes into, as you're looking at your books, what kind of goes into it as you're building your magical systems? Because obviously you have a lot of thought in this. You're talking about how the number of players who can use magic is building into the world. So how do you kind of build these magical systems in your books?
So I would love to be a more systematic magic maker, like a Brandon Sanderson or somebody who has like 5 different extremely intricate semi-scientific magical systems that have very defined rules, and I per book, like 5 per book or 5 per series. I tend to, so for this book, the magic comes from the spirits. So I kind of started with the setting, and knowing that it was a magical island with spirits who live on this island, who are the source of the magical power. And honestly, from there, it was more just like trying to figure out how how I can construct a magic system that's internally coherent, but that is also going to serve my purposes in terms of plot and character development. So they say that, sorry, there's 2 kinds of magic in books. There's like hard magic and soft magic. And hard magic would be like your Mistborn books, or I don't know, maybe Name of the Wind, although I think that's a little fuzzy. And soft magic would be something like in Lord of the Rings, where we have our wizard Gandalf, and he's wizard, but it's not super clear what exactly he can do other than like his staff lights up, and then sometimes it comes in handy against Balrogs. That is the example of soft magic, where magic is giving sort of like an ambiance. It's giving you a sense of the mystical. It's giving you cool vibes, but it's not something that has hard and fast rules that you have to operate by. And I think my magic is somewhere in between. I don't have... some people come up with magic systems that are basically like science, like an alternate science for their world. And I want my magic systems to be internally coherent, but I don't necessarily want to lay out all the rules for you, because to me that's a little boring. And I don't want to have to make up all those rules either. Yeah.
Well, and unless your character is really kind of the equivalent of a scientist, I think that makes sense. I liked your parallel of magic to an alternative science, because like, yeah, we all do some chemistry when we bake. Right. Book, but I could not explain it to you. Right. Yeah. So it has to be consistent such that you can imagine there are rules behind it, right? And that if it's contradicting itself, then you're just your universe is incoherent. But you don't have to know how all of it works. Actually, Harry Potter is also like this, where there's magic and like it feels very cool and you learn some of the stuff, but it's mostly just saying spells and waving a wand, right? Like you can learn almost you can learn almost all the spells you need in your first 2 years. Yeah, it's true. For life. Yeah, you have to defeat the Dark Lord and run your life as an adult. It's great.
Yeah, I had a pretty different process for my first book, which I don't know if we're going to talk about, but just it's
Yeah,
called
let's talk about it.
it's set in 1792, and it's about a teenage alchemist who's about to create the Philosopher's Stone. And for that, I cheated a little bit for my magic system because I just took alchemy and was like, and it works. It's real. And of course, there's you can do tons of research about alchemy. It's very well documented. It just unfortunately does not actually produce the things that it wanted to produce. But it's basically a magic system from history, all set and ready to be used. So I found that to be very helpful.
Nice. So
Yeah.
in Bright Room Things, you're in the 1920s, and you talked a little bit about Gatsby, and of course, we all love a good Gatsby esque party. But so in your first book, you said 1792. What took you to that time period?
That's a good question. I kind of forget, to be honest with you. I really like the French Revolution, and I found that to be a really fascinating time period. And I had been reading some books set during that time and listening to a podcast. And it's not a time that you actually really historically associate with alchemy. I mean, alchemy was going on then, but it wasn't like its golden age. But I think what really appealed to me about it was the sort of the revolution in worldviews that was happening then. So you had a lot of huge paradigm shifts happening in the way that people thought of the state, the aristocracy, the monarchy, men and women, religion. They were just the French Revolution is a good example of that in action, but it wasn't just happening in France. It was happening all over, and obviously the American Revolution had been not very far before that. So I liked the idea of setting a book in a time where there was just a lot of mind changing happening on a world scale, and to me that made it an interesting backdrop for the plot that I was thinking about writing about.
Well, and I think that's really fascinating with the French Revolution, because you mentioned earlier that you love stories kind of about outsiders. And if you look at kind of the cultural zeitgeist that were happening in the late 1700s, you do have a lot of people who've been marginalized or kind of on the outsides of power structures all of a sudden finding themselves positioned to where they could imagine themselves as the protagonists and taking action in the world.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and in some ways that really is like sort of one of the original outsider stories. People without power rising up and demanding their rights. Yeah, it's the basis for a lot of outsider stories.
And so now both of your books that you've written have been young adult novels. And I'm curious what you love about the young adult genre and what kind of brought you into the genre.
I think for me, I was reading a lot of young adult books, and what I really loved about it was that it's a whole genre that's exploring this time of life that I find to be really interesting, where you are starting to understand who you are, but who you are going to become is still malleable. And when I think back to my teenage years, it's always so interesting to me to think about like the choices that I made that were so formative and decisive and who I ended up being. And so I think that in some way that's going to be what's interesting about almost any story, is like the choices that you make and who you become as a result of it. That's almost like the template of every story, but it's particularly powerful in those teenage years because the stakes are even higher, because it's all potential. Because there's just sort of no limit to the changes that you can make in your life at that age. For me also, I found myself going back to those years because there was stuff that I personally needed to work out. So in both of these books, I actually, in all the young adult novels that I've written so far, I've gone back to a certain aspect of my teenage self, and kind of written a story around that part of who I was. So I guess eventually, if I run out of parts of my teenage years that I am interested in thinking about, then I might just need to write adult novels. But that was what drew me to that initially. I think also a lot of fantasy novels are young adult, and I love reading and writing fantasy. It just felt like the ultimate escape, in addition to all this, like, soul searching that I've been referring to. So it sort of combined, like, I don't know, it seemed a lot easier than therapy. In the end, you find out you do have to go to therapy too, but yeah, it was a fun way to explore things.
Absolutely. And being able to build that narrative arc that, our own lives are not obligated to meet. Like,
Right.
our lives can have loose ends and go off in strange directions, but
Yes.
fiction doesn't work very well that way.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Although I have a habit of writing, I'm not going to say ambiguous endings, but like endings that aren't completely wrapped up. And I think part of the reason I do that is because it does feel more true to those teenage years, especially. I don't love stories where a teenage protagonist ends up with the person they're going to stay with for the rest of their life. Yeah, because
It's a young age to put a happily ever after.
It is. Yeah, it's
all the interesting
you're
things.
18, date somebody else. Don't settle down yet. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and like what we were talking about, that, one of the things that is exciting about writing about teenage protagonists is that there's a lifetime of, I can't think of a word that sounds negative, but consequences unfolding from the decisions that take place,
Right.
Encapsulated in the story. And consequences makes it sound really negative, and that's not what I mean. But
that's what I mean when I say the stakes are high, is that, like, there's just so much that's going to unfold because of it. Yeah, because of the choices.
And I think some of the energy you were talking about with what she was interesting about Gatsby as kind of a literature model is also really potent in young adult, which is also the idea of not just discovering oneself, but discovering that the world is more complicated and often a little bit darker than you thought it was.
Yes.
That you've got an aspiration, and all of a sudden the cost of getting to that point can be high.
Yeah. That is a really good point. And that is definitely one of the things that I explored a lot, especially in Bright Ruined Things, is that I remember being a teenager and thinking I really, really understood what everything was in the world. And I didn't think that I was naive or overly optimistic. Actually, kind of the reverse. I thought I was really cynical. But I think it ended up being the case that I was both overly optimistic and overly cynical. So it is very interesting to me to write about worldview changes. For everyone, young people, old people, everyone can change their worldview and should. But yeah, it's something that I related to a lot when I look back at those teenage years.
Absolutely. So you mentioned kind of looking back on those teenage years was one of the things that brought you to writing. But could you tell us a little bit about kind of your path to being a writer?
Yeah. So I always loved writing and reading. Well, I always loved reading. And then I started deciding that I wanted to write as well one summer when I kind of ran out of books for a while. And I was like, how can I spend more time in a fictional world? And so I started writing rip-offs of Lord of the Rings, as many as many fantasy writers did. And I just assumed that that was something that nobody could do as a career, like being an astronaut or an actress. Or, some people could, but they're like very few and far between. So I thought a much more promising or practical career would be to be a professor. And it turns out that that is a worse field to try to have a career in than as a writer. But I didn't know that at the time. So I started writing after I had quit grad school in philosophy and was having kids and sort of just needed something to do to not just lose my mind being bored all the time. Like, not that, I mean, having kids is wonderful, but sometimes it's really boring. And I spent 7 years writing my first novel. And it took 7 years because I didn't know what I was doing at all. And also because kids are really distracting. So that novel, I had no intention of publishing. I was just writing it for fun. I really wasn't thinking about it as a career. I was actually working as a chef at the time, and then I became a Latin teacher. Anyway, so writing was a hobby, but when I finished my first book, I loved it so much. Not just the book. I thought the book was fantastic, but the experience that I had of finally finishing it and like the way the plot like worked out and how it really just absorbed me. And I had not thought that I was going to be able to finish it. That seemed like almost an impossible thing to put a story together that works. Seemed kind of like magic. And when I was able to do that, I just really fell in love with the idea of being a writer. And I looked into it, and I had a friend who was also looking into it around the same time. And we kind of went through it together. Like, she started querying agents, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess that's something you do. So I started querying agents, and I did get an agent I don't know if you're if the audience would know, but if you're a writer, you need an agent to represent you, but to sell your books to publishers, basically. So they're like the gatekeepers. They will probably help you edit your book, and then they will help you sell your book to publishers who wouldn't look at. They don't look at unagented submissions anymore. Not big publishers, and even some small publishers don't. So it's really hard to get an agent because this is the gatekeeping process, right? Like, you don't need an MFA. You don't need any kind of credential to get published. It just needs to be good enough to stand out in a big crowd. And so my agent gets like hundreds of queries every week. And so if you write a query, it's like this long paragraph about your book, and you have to make your book sound like something they want to read, keeping in mind that they're getting like 300 others of these. They just have to try to go through their inbox as fast as possible. So I did get an agent for my first book, which is unpublished still. We still haven't gone on submission with it. And while I was revising that book with her, I wrote A Golden Fury. And when I sent A Golden Fury to my agent, she was like, oh, okay, yeah, stop revising this other book. We're going to go out with this one. Because, I mean, I still love that first book I wrote, but I didn't write it with any kind of sense of what the market wanted and what was trendy or just current at all. So then we published this one, and then we published Bright Ruined Things, and both of them came out during the pandemic, which was not a great time to debut a book. But yeah, it was it's been still a wonderful experience being able to see my book being read, and both of them, thousands of people have read my books now. Actually, I just had never, when I was a kid writing, I thought that was impossible. I didn't really think that was ever going to happen. So yeah, it's been great.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and it has to be an incredible feeling to see it out in the world. Probably
It
also
is.
nerve-wracking to send your babies out into the world. And
Yeah, I think I didn't realize how painful it was going to be to get bad reviews. Like now, most of my reviews are good, but like I can't stop myself. It's not a good author practice. You should not read all your reviews, especially like on Goodreads. To some extent, that's like not your business. To some extent, that's readers talking to each other, and you're just eavesdropping. But I still read them all, and I really did not realize how much it was going to affect me to read people just be like, kind of boring, 2 stars. It's like, you get hardened to it after a while, but yeah, it was a unanticipated psychological effect.
did it make writing Bright Ruined things harder since you had a golden out there with all those reviews?
So it didn't make writing Bright Ruined Things harder because I wrote Bright Ruined Things while I was on submission with the Golden Fury. So I had Bright Ruined Things written before A Golden Fury was published, written and sold before it was published. But it did make writing the book that I'm out on submission with now quite a bit harder. I think it is a totally different process when you're writing entirely for yourself. It's just different than when you are thinking about how it's going to be received by an audience, and you can't unwind that thread. Like you can't just think, well, I'm just going to ignore it, because it's your job to appeal to an audience. And if you find out that something that you tend to write doesn't fit with your audience's expectations, you can't just ignore it, because then your books won't sell. You just won't have a feature in the industry. So it seems like, like it should be really obvious. Like, well, if it's hard for you when you're paying attention to other people's opinions about your work to keep writing, then you should just ignore it. But it's impossible. You kind of can't ignore it. So it changes the process. It changes it from something that you're just doing for joy and love of the story to something that you're doing with commerce and selling in mind. So it kind of just I'm not going to say it kills the magic, because writing is still magical and wonderful. But to the extent that publishing intrudes on writing, it does kind of take some of the joy away. So it's really important to protect that as much as possible, which I haven't quite figured out how to do yet. I think it's kind of a universal struggle for authors, and clearly some people have figured it out. So I'm hoping that I will be one of them.
It sounds like a really difficult balance to do, even especially with the addition of commerce, but even ever so slightly to the side of that, between telling the story that matters to you and that you're excited about, and keeping in mind that you need to tell it in a way that the people who are listening are interested in it. That, it is conversation at that point. It's not just self-expression.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
It sounds.
Yeah, because if you were just really writing for yourself, then you wouldn't care about publishing it, right? Like you just write it and put it away in a drawer. And some people do that. And there's something kind of great about that. Like people who truly are just writing for themselves. But most of us aren't doing that. Most of us are writing because we want to tell a story to people. And so then it's not that every person's reaction to the story matters, because your story's not for everyone. But if you're just missing your audience, you got to know that. You got to care.
You got to know it is reaching the people that the story's for.
Right. Yeah.
So what is your writing practice like? Do you have a strict schedule? Do you write, a little bit more loosely as inspiration strikes you? Obviously, there's deadlines. You have stories on submission.
Yeah, I do have children, so I take them to school, and then I have about 3 to 4 hours of good creative brain time in me. I think I used to have more, but then something about publishing and TikTok and the pandemic just kind of like scrambled my brain. So now I've got 3 to 4 on a good day of which is fine because that's fits with my schedule. So my writing practice involves setting aside time. For a long time, I didn't have big chunks of time to write in, so I would set aside smaller ones, and that's how I got books written. But now I will have the morning, and it's just a fight against my brain's desire for distraction. So I would say in the thick of the pandemic, when I was the most having just the hardest time concentrating, I would put my phone in a drawer, turn off the internet on my computer, sit in my living room, and I would have 30-minute sprints where I'd have 30 minutes where all I could do is write, and I was writing by hand too. This is when I was the most, as I said, like when my brain was the most pudding. I wrote by hand because writing on my computer was too distracting, because even with the internet off, I could like look at, I don't know, pictures or something. It was just so write by hand in a notebook, which I found also was helpful because I don't know, something about it turned off my inner editor, because it's harder to, like back up, erase or whatever. So you just kind of tend to keep going, which is important for me when I'm drafting. And I could either write or I could stare into space. Those were my two options for 30 minutes. And when the timer went off, I could get up, I could like check my phone, I could, have a snack or switch the laundry over or something. But I got an entire book written in those like 30-minute intervals of forcing myself to concentrate. I know I got that. It's like a revised version of what Neil Gaiman does, where he says that he does about, I don't know, 4 hours too, where he just sits in his room and he also puts away his phone and stuff. And his choice is write or stare into space, but he does it for 4 hours. Which I'm not there yet. I do it for 4 hours, but in half an hour increments. So that's my best practice right now. I've been co-writing something secret with a friend, and for us, it's helped a lot. The sprinting method has helped a lot, especially if you have somebody you're working with, where you're going to like compare your word count at the end. It really does help you to stay on task.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I like that. I like that little bit of competition in there too, of comparing word count.
Yeah. Yeah. In my case, it's usually not so much comparing as just like trying to keep up. Like I'm a competitive person, but I'm just a slower writer than she is. So I'm just like, I can't fall too far behind. Yeah.
I was wondering whether you do a lot of kind of planning before you start writing with your books, or if you kind of start with the narrative and pull in the plot and some of the structure elements as it unfolds with you.
It's kind of varied from book to book. I will start with whatever about the book is most interesting to me. Mm-hmm. So in the case of Bright Ruined Things, it was kind of like setting and the outsider character. It was the setting, which included the magic, because that was part of the setting, the magic island, and the outsider character. And then I was like, actually, initially I thought I was going to structure it like a mystery. And it still has some elements of a mystery, but it's not like a classic mystery structure. But usually I start with a concept, I will work on the characters first because that's the part that I find maybe the easiest. And then that I like to build a plot from my characters. So from my characters' needs and goals, and also their like misbelief, the thing that they believe about themselves that they think they need that's wrong, that they're going to find out over the course of the book is a lie that they've been telling themselves. So I like to start with that, and then I also need to know the ending. I do not do like a really detailed structured outline. I do a lot of pre-work, but it tends to be not super organized. So in the case of A Golden Fury, I thought I knew the ending. And I thought I knew what I was working towards, but it turned out that what I was really working towards was actually a midpoint and not the climax. And so then the last third of the book just didn't work at all. And when I sent it to my agent, she was like, "This is fantastic, except for you need to rewrite the entire last third of the book," which involved quite a lot of restructuring. But with Bright Ruined Things, I did know the ending. I did know what the climax was, and writing the climax to the ending of this book was like maybe the second most satisfying writing experience I ever had after just finishing a book the first time. It felt like one of those times where it just, well, I don't know, it was almost like supernatural inspiration. It was like, where is this coming from? Oh my gosh. But I did know the ending because I had come up with it in advance, but it was just flowing so well. I thought it was really great. And every time that I reread Bright Ruined Things during edits, which was like, 50 million times, I would there were parts where I'd be like, oh my gosh, I've read this 50 million times. But then I would get to the end and be like, yeah, what? This is amazing. So hopefully you guys like it too.
And I think that's great in terms of, you talk about your characters and their motivations being a big part of it, structuring. And I feel like when you get that momentum toward the end, it's a sign that really is flowing
right
logically and emotionally from who they've been and what they've been doing through that whole book.
Yeah, that is always the key, is to make the character journey and the plot journey line up together, make sense together.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
We've got about 15 minutes. So I've got two last short questions, and then we've got a couple of questions in the question and answer. And I mentioned the question and answer in case anybody in the audience has been waiting on a question to drop that in, because we'll be going through those in just a second. But one of the things we love to ask is there a book you've read recently that you would recommend?
Yes.
Or not recently. It can be a favorite from whenever.
Well, I was thinking, I'm just trying to remember the name of it. There was one that I really, really loved. It was the new book by Emily St. John Mandel, Sea of Tranquility?
I think that's it, Sea of Tranquility.
Yeah, that book was dope. Yeah, it's sort of sci-fi. It is sci-fi. I think it's sci-fi. But it's like literary sci-fi. It's partly set on the moon and some other space colonies. It does some time jumping, and it's got a really cool twist. The way it all comes together, I think, is really awesome. So that, and then a YA book that I read recently, actually that I just finished. It's called Winders by Ryan Onan. It's also sci-fi. I guess I'm on a sci-fi kick. But the premise of that is that you can, there's a small group of people, like mutants or whatever, who can rewind time by not very much, just like seconds, or like I think the longest recorded one is like 2 minutes or something. But it changes. They think of themselves as like this super species, because if you can rewind time, you can be good at so many. It's like cheating at life, right? Like you're in a debate and you slip up, you just rewind, you just do it again. You can do it as many times as you need to, and then you win that debate. Like you can't mess up, basically. So it was a really cool premise, really well executed plot. It was very action adventure-y, and kind of read like a movie almost. It was really good. So I recommend those.
Yeah, Wider sounds fascinating with just a little bit of time. That's an interesting twist on kind of the time travel.
Yeah, it's like time travel adjacent is how I think the author describes it. It's really good.
Fantastic. And then my last one before we go to Q&A is, what's next for you? What do you have in the works? Bright Ruined Things was published this year, correct? So.
Yep. Yeah, so I have a Celtic, sort of Roman-occupied Celtic fantasy that is on submission right now. So I don't know yet when that will be out in the world, but that is also a YA, and that was my pandemic book that I wrote when my brain was melted. But I think I really love it. I think it's it had a really thrilling to write plot twist. And I also am writing an adult novel right now that I'm not totally sure what genre it will end up being, but right now the pitch for it is 3 siblings with magic powers ruin a wedding.
Ooh.
Yeah. But that is very much in process, and it feels like a stretch for me. It's because it's meant to be, there's like a bit of a speculative element, but it's mostly meant to be like an adult literary novel, and that's not what I've written so far, so it's taking me a little bit outside of my comfort zone.
Which is hopefully fun.
Yeah, which is really fun and scary and hard and fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm also excited for that Roman-occupied Celtic lands novel. I know you mentioned you're a Latin teacher or have been a Latin teacher. I hope there's one good Latin pun in there with the Roman.
I have a good Latin pun actually in A Golden Fury. I'm not going to give it away, but
I haven't had a chance to read Golden Fury yet, but I'm going to have to and take a look at this one. So, all right, we've got a couple questions, and the first one is, what are your 5 favorite adverbs?
Oh, well, I like quickly. Quickly, I just feel like the sound is really nice. Quickly. I don't know if I have any other favorite adverbs. I just love all adverbs equally. If it's an adverb, then I want to use it. I feel like it should be in every sentence, but they won't let you do that. They make you delete them. They claim it's not good writing. Yeah. I don't know. I actually think adverbs get kind of a bad rap, and we should just embrace them in general. Like throw a charmingly or softly on the end of every like dialogue tag.
Yeah. You know?
Yeah.
It's time for the age of adverbs.
If I ever self-published, I'm going to do it. It's just going to be adverbs everywhere. If no editor gets a say in it, then there are going to be so many adverbs.
Yeah. Every time someone tells you to take one out, you just add 2 more.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, you don't like those adverbs? Oh.
And then our next question is, this is talking about Bright Ruined Things, about whether Ivo, is that the correct pronunciation?
Yeah, Ivo.
Whether he correlates to Caliban in The Tempest.
Yeah, so it's complicated because in a way he definitely does, but then in another way he is, he's an interesting character because he's both an outcast from his family, like Caliban, and there's a lot of, he bears a lot of sort of the darkness and shame from the family, kind of like Caliban, but then he also is in another way very privileged in that family in that he is like the heir. to the magic and the one who can do the magic, which, so yes, yes and no. Like there aren't direct parallels except for Lord Prosper, who is, an analog of Prospero, and Eris, who's the spirit, who's pretty obviously Ariel. Aside from those, there aren't direct parallels to the characters because, to be honest, I took a lot of elements from of themes and world building from The Tempest, but the plot is really not the same. And that I think is mostly because I just two reasons. I don't love the plot of The Tempest. I think it's a little weird. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's so the plot is very much like, and Prosper, like Lord Prosper is my character, and Prospero controls everything and like brings everyone together and shows everyone how they treated him badly, and then is revealed to be the wise one who was in charge all along, and who everyone needs to repent of their sins against and obey. And that honestly was kind of exactly what I was reacting against in the plot of my book. So it's not a direct retelling, and there aren't necessarily direct character parallels. But I do think that the question picks up on something really valid, which is that Ivo does he does bear some of that role that Caliban has in The Tempest, for sure.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think that's interesting with what you've been talking about with your interest in writing and writing bright ruined things. That, yeah, the traditional narrative of The Tempest is very Prospero has magic, and he should have magic because he's a very smart man.
Yeah, and people did him wrong, and they should be sad and sorry for it, but he will forgive them because he is so magnanimous, and because eventually everyone's going to do what he says.
One way or another.
And that's why people think that Prospero was a stand-in for Shakespeare himself. Because if you're going to write that kind of character, aren't you kind of thinking it's you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well, but otherwise, Samantha, thank you so much for joining us. This
you're so welcome.
Insight. And we're so excited to be including your book in our Battle of the Books program. We're so excited to have our teams really dig into it and answer some questions about it at our event in February. So thank you so much for kind of building out not just your book, but also giving all of our attendees an image into what your career is like as a writer, because, we talked to a number of authors through the series and everyone approaches writing a little bit differently. And I think it's fantastic to see the many ways that creativity plays out in our writing communities.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun. I definitely wish everyone involved in the Battle of Books great battle. I wish I could see it. It'd be fun to be there.
We'll see if we can figure out a way to get at least a little bit of it shared after the event.
That would be awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Samantha. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Yeah. Thank you.